Nolan Thompson's first day at the NASA Earth Cooperative Space Station takes an unexpected turn when his alien boss demands to see between his legs. The 28-year-old human engineer steps into the engineering bay, heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. His eyes widen as he spots his new supervisor, a female NASAT named Stella, her exoskeleton a vibrant shade of purple that stands out against the metallic walls. Stella's antennae twitch rapidly as she approaches Nolan. "Welcome aboard," she clicks, her mandibles moving in an alien approximation of a smile. "As department head, it's my duty to ensure all new employees undergo a thorough physical examination." Nolan nods, assuming this is standard procedure. He follows Stella to a private medical bay, the doors hissing shut behind them. The room is sterile and cold, filled with unfamiliar equipment that hums softly. "Please remove your clothing," Stella instructs, her compound eyes fixed intently on Nolan. He hesitates, a knot forming in his stomach. "Is this really necessary? I had a full medical workup before leaving Earth." Stella's exoskeleton shifts to a deeper purple, her movements becoming more agitated. "It's crucial for ensuring compatibility with our environment. NASAT Custom demands it." As Nolan reluctantly begins to undress, Stella explains that her species is currently in breeding season. Her voice takes on a husky quality as she admits, "Human anatomy fascinates me. I need to inspect your genitals personally." Nolan freezes, his shirt half unbuttoned. He's torn between following orders and maintaining his boundaries. The situation feels increasingly uncomfortable as Stella's breeding instincts intensify her demands. "This is highly irregular," Nolan protests, taking a step back. "I don't think this is part of any official protocol." Stella clicks her mandibles in frustration, her antennae quivering with barely contained energy. "As your superior, I insist. It's vital for interspecies relations." The air grows thick with tension as Nolan weighs his options. He's acutely aware of the potential consequences for his career and human NASAT diplomacy. Stella's aggression mounts, her exoskeleton now a deep, pulsating purple. Just as the confrontation reaches a breaking point, alarms blare throughout the station. Red lights flash, bathing the medical bay in an eerie glow. "Emergency in Sector 7, a computerized voice announces. "All personnel report to stations immediately." Nolan and Stella lock eyes, the unresolved sexual tension crackling between them. Without a word, they rush out of the medical bay, their personal drama overshadowed by the station-wide crisis. As they race to their posts, Nolan can't help but wonder what awaits him when the emergency subsides, and if he'll be able to navigate the complexities of working under an alien boss in heat. The blaring alarms jolted Nolan and Stella out of their tense standoff. Without a word, they rushed from the medical bay, their personal drama instantly overshadowed by the station-wide crisis. As they raced through the corridors, Nolan's mind struggled to process the whiplash from intimate examination to urgent emergency. They burst into the engineering control room, greeted by a cacophony of warning signals and frantic crew members. Holographic displays flashed red, highlighting critical failures across multiple systems. Nolan's eyes widened as he took in the severity of the situation. "Status report," Stella demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. A junior engineer, his face pale with panic, responded, "The oxygen recyclers are failing, ma'am. We're losing life support across all decks." Nolan stepped forward, pushing aside his lingering discomfort from the earlier encounter. This was his chance to prove his worth. He moved to the main console, fingers flying over the holographic interface as he accessed system diagnostics. "It's a cascade failure in the main processor," he announced, eyes narrowing as he delved deeper into the data. "Look at these readings. There's damage consistent with a micrometeorite impact." Stella's antennae twitched rapidly as she processed the information. "Initiate emergency protocols," she ordered the crew. "All non-essential personnel, don protective gear, and report to designated safe zones." As the room emptied, Stella turned to Nolan. "Can you fix it?" He nodded, already formulating a plan. "I'll need to access the maintenance shaft to reach the damaged components. It's going to be tight." Stella's exoskeleton shifted to a deep purple. "I'm coming with you. My body is better suited for confined spaces." Nolan wanted to protest, but there was no time. They grabbed toolkits and emergency repair supplies before making their way to the access point. The maintenance shaft was a narrow tube barely wide enough for Nolan to squeeze through. He entered first, the cold metal pressing against his sides as he inched forward. He felt Stella enter behind him, her exoskeleton scraping softly against the walls. In the confined space, her alien scent, a sweet, almost floral aroma, filled his nostrils. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but her proximity was impossible to ignore. As they reached the damaged section, Nolan began his work. His fingers moved deftly, disconnecting fried circuits and bypassing damaged pathways. Stella watched intently, her compound eyes taking in every detail. "Your manual dexterity is impressive," she commented, her voice low and husky. "How does your body respond to such intense situations? I notice increased perspiration and elevated respiration." Nolan swallowed hard, acutely aware of how close they were. "It's a normal stress response in humans," he managed to reply, trying to keep his voice steady. "Helps us focus in emergencies." As he worked, he became increasingly aware of Stella's alien biology. Her exoskeleton seemed to pulse with subtle color changes, shifting from deep purple to an almost iridescent blue. The sweet scent emanating from her grew stronger, clouding his thoughts. "Damn," Nolan muttered as he encountered a more severely damaged section. "I need the plasma cutter from the engineering bay. This damage is worse than I thought." He attempted to back out of the shaft but found himself stuck, his broader shoulders wedged tightly in the narrow passage. Panic flared in his chest as he realized he couldn't move. "Stella, I'm trapped," he grunted, trying to suppress his rising claustrophobia. He felt her multiple limbs grasp his body, her strength surprising as she maneuvered to help extract him. The intimate contact sent a jolt through Nolan's system, a confusing mix of fear and unexpected arousal. With a final push, he popped free from the shaft, stumbling back into the corridor. He took a moment to catch his breath, painfully aware of Stella's closeness and the lingering sensation of her touch. "I'll get the plasma cutter," he said quickly, eager for a moment of space to clear his head. When he returned, Stella was waiting at the entrance to the maintenance shaft. Her antennae quivered with an intensity he hadn't seen before, and her exoskeleton had taken on a deep, pulsating purple hue. "I must monitor your progress closely," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "The safety of the station depends on your success." Nolan nodded, unable to argue as the oxygen levels continued to drop. They re-entered the shaft, the closeness even more pronounced now. As he worked on the delicate repair, Stella pressed against him, her antennae brushing his skin in a way that sent shivers down his spine. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but Stella's proximity was overwhelming. Her limbs seemed to find constant reasons to touch him, adjusting his position or steadying his hands. The sweet scent emanating from her exoskeleton grew stronger, almost intoxicating in the enclosed space. With a final connection, the systems hummed back to life. Relief washed over Nolan as he watched the diagnostic readings return to normal. "We did it," he breathed, turning to face Stella in the cramped shaft. Her response caught him off guard. She embraced him tightly, her exoskeleton pressing against his body as she clicked and chirped in what he assumed was gratitude and admiration. The moment was charged with an intensity that left Nolan breathless and conflicted. Their intimate moment was interrupted by a sharp voice from the shaft's entrance. "Thompson, report!" Captain Xander Voss, the station's human commander, stood at the opening, his expression a mix of relief and concern. Nolan extricated himself from Stella's embrace, acutely aware of how the situation must appear. As they climbed out of the maintenance shaft, Captain Voss pulled Nolan aside. His voice was low and serious. "Outstanding work, Thompson. You may have saved us all." He paused, glancing at Stella, who hovered nearby, her antennae still twitching in Nolan's direction. "But we need to talk about interspecies protocols, especially during NASAT breeding season." Nolan's stomach dropped as he realized the full implications of his situation. The captain's words hinted at past incidents and potential diplomatic nightmares. As Stella moved closer, her exoskeleton pulsing with awe-inspiring energy, Nolan found himself caught between his growing attraction and the weight of his professional responsibilities. The crisis had been averted, but Nolan sensed that his challenges on the NASAT Earth Cooperative Space Station were a long way to go. Captain Voss's warning echoed in Nolan's mind as he left the meeting, acutely aware of Stella's presence beside him. The days that followed were a delicate dance of professionalism and unspoken tension. Nolan threw himself into his work, determined to prove his worth beyond the recent crisis, but found it increasingly difficult to ignore the alien allure of his superior. Stella's exoskeleton seemed to pulse with impossibly strong energy whenever they were in proximity, her antennae twitching in ways that spoke volumes without words. The engineering bay became a minefield of accidental touches and lingering glances, each interaction charged with potential. A week after the life support incident, Nolan was running diagnostics on the primary coolant systems when the station-wide comm crackled to life. Captain Voss's voice cut through the ambient hum of machinery. All senior staff report to the command center immediately. We have an urgent situation. Nolan's eyes met Stella's across the room. Her exoskeleton had shifted to a deep, iridescent purple that seemed to captivate him. He shook off the distraction and followed her to the command center, maintaining a careful distance. Captain Voss stood before a holographic display of a nearby asteroid, his face grim. "We've received a distress call from the Helios mining outpost," he announced as the room filled. "They're reporting critical equipment failure threatening their oxygen supply." The captain's gaze settled on Nolan and Stella. "Given your recent experience with our own life support crisis, I'm assigning you two to lead a small team to the asteroid. Your expertise could mean the difference between life and death for those miners." Nolan felt a mix of pride and apprehension at the assignment. He glanced at Stella, whose antennae were quivering with what he now recognized as excitement. "Prepare for immediate departure," Voss ordered. "Time is of the essence." As they rushed to gather equipment and brief their team, Nolan couldn't help but notice the intensity of Stella's pheromones. The sweet floral scent seemed more potent than ever, clouding his thoughts. He tried to focus on the mission parameters, but found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the intricate patterns on Stella's exoskeleton, which now pulsed with a subtle bioluminescence. The shuttle launch was textbook, but as they approached the asteroid, alarms blared through the cockpit. "Artificial gravity malfunction," the ship's computer announced. Nolan felt the sudden weightlessness take hold, his body lifting from the seat. "Brace yourselves," he called out, reaching for a handhold. But before he could grab it, he collided with Stella, who had been floating towards the control panel, her multiple limbs instinctively wrapped around him, steadying them both. Nolan's breath caught in his throat as he felt the vibrations of her exoskeleton against his chest. Their faces were inches apart, Stella's compound eyes reflecting his startled expression. "Apologies," Stella clicked, her mandibles brushing against his ear. "My species is better adapted to zero-G environments." Despite her words, she made no move to release him. Nolan swallowed hard, acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies. "No problem," he managed, his voice hoarse. "We should, secure ourselves for landing." With visible reluctance, Stella disentangled herself, using her limbs to gracefully maneuver back to her station. Nolan tried to ignore the lingering sensation of her touch as he focused on the approaching asteroid. The landing was rougher than anticipated, the shuttle skidding across the rocky surface before coming to a stop. As they disembarked, the true scale of the crisis became apparent. The mining outpost's main structure was dark, emergency lights casting an eerie glow through viewports. "Life support is critical," one of the team members reported, checking readings on a handheld device. "We've got less than 3 hours before oxygen levels become lethal." Nolan nodded grimly. "Let's move. Stella, you're with me in the main engineering section. The rest of you, fan out and assist with evacuations if necessary." As they entered the outpost, the damage was immediately evident. Sparking wires hung from ceilings, and the acrid smell of burned electronics filled the air. Nolan and Stella made their way to the central power core, forced to squeeze through partially collapsed corridors. In the cramped engineering section, they found the source of the problem, a gaping hole in the power core's casing, likely from a micrometeorite impact. Nolan immediately set to work, his fingers flying over the emergency control panel. "We need to reroute power from the auxiliary systems," he muttered, more to himself than Stella. But she was there instantly, her limbs extending to reach panels he couldn't access. As they worked in tandem, Nolan found himself hyper-aware of Stella's every movement. Her exoskeleton seemed to pulse with increased luminescence, reacting to the stress of the situation, or perhaps to his proximity. The sweet scent of her pheromones filled the enclosed space, making it difficult for him to concentrate. "Nolan?" Stella's voice was low, almost a purr. "I need you to access that control junction." She pointed to a narrow crevice behind a tangle of cables. He nodded, squeezing into the tight space. But as he reached for the panel, he felt his body begin to slip. Suddenly, Stella was there, her limbs wrapping around him, bracing his body against hers. The position left them pressed together intimately, her exoskeleton vibrating against his back in a way that sent shivers down his spine. "I've got you," she clicked, her mandibles brushing against his neck. "Make the connection." Nolan took a shaky breath, trying to focus on the task at hand and not the feeling of Stella's alien body molded against his. With trembling fingers, he made the final connections. The power core hummed to life, lights flickering on throughout the outpost. A cheer went up from the rescue team over the comms, but Nolan barely heard it. He turned in Stella's embrace, their faces mere inches apart. The tension that had been building for weeks reached its breaking point. Nolan wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly they were entangled in a passionate, exploratory embrace. His hands traced the contours of her exoskeleton, marveling at the textures and subtle vibrations. Stella's limbs caressed him with an alien gentleness that took his breath away. Their encounter was brief but intense, a release of pent-up desire and adrenaline. As they broke apart, breathless and disoriented, the reality of their situation came crashing back. "We should rejoin the others," Nolan said, his voice rough. Stella's antenna twitched in agreement, but her compound eyes remained fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart race. As they made their way back to the shuttle, Nolan's mind whirled with the implications of what had just happened. They had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The professional distance he had tried so hard to maintain had evaporated in the heat of the moment. Boarding the shuttle, Nolan caught Captain Voss's voice over the comms, congratulating them on a successful mission. But as he settled into his seat, Stella's limb brushing against his in a way that couldn't be accidental, he knew that the real challenges were only beginning. The shuttle detached from the asteroid, carrying them back to the NASA Earth Cooperative Space Station and to an uncertain future. Neither Nolan nor Stella noticed the small indicator light on the outpost security panel, signaling the transmission of the mission's data package, including all recorded footage, back to the station's central computer. Database. Nolan and Stella remained oblivious to this crucial detail as the shuttle docked with the station. As they disembarked, the usual bustle of the arrival bay seemed muted. Crew members cast furtive glances in their direction, whispering among themselves. Nolan felt a growing unease, intensified by the lingering scent of Stella's pheromones. "Thompson, Chakur, report to my office immediately." Captain Voss's voice crackled over their personal communicators, his tone clipped and formal. Exchanging worried looks, Nolan and Stella made their way to the command deck. The captain's office door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Voss seated behind his desk, his expression grave. "Sit down," he ordered, gesturing to the chairs before him. As they complied, Voss tapped a control on his desk. A holographic display flickered to life between them, showing footage from the asteroid outpost's engineering section. Nolan's stomach dropped as he watched the scene unfold. Their frantic repair work, the moment of triumph, and then their intimate embrace captured in vivid detail. He felt the blood drain from his face as the reality of the situation hit him. "This security footage," Voss said, his voice dangerously calm, "was transmitted back to the station along with the mission report, an unfortunate glitch in our communications protocol." Stella's exoskeleton pulsed with a deep, agitated red. Her antennae twitched rapidly, a clear sign of distress to Nolan's now attuned senses. "Captain, I can explain," Nolan began, but Voss held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it, Thompson. This isn't just about you two anymore. We're looking at a full-blown diplomatic incident." Voss leaned forward, his gaze intense. "A joint human NASAT ethics committee is being formed as we speak. They'll arrive within 48 hours to investigate this situation and its potential impact on our cooperation. Nolan felt the weight of Voss's words settle on his shoulders. Beside him, Stella clicked her mandibles softly, a sound he now recognized as anxiety. Until then, Voss continued, you are both to limit your interactions to strictly professional matters. Am I clear? Yes, sir, Nolan responded automatically. Stella bobbed her head in agreement, her usual fluid movements stiff and jerky. As they left the captain's office, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, every passing crew member a potential judge of their actions. Nolan's mind raced, replaying the events on the asteroid, searching for a way to justify what had happened. They reached a junction where their paths diverged. Nolan to the human quarters, Stella to the NASAT section of the station. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the air between them charged with unspoken words and lingering desire. Nolan, Stella began, her voice low and melodic. Not here. Nolan cut her off, glancing around nervously. We shouldn't. Stella's antennae drooped slightly, but she nodded in understanding. Without another word, she turned and glided away, leaving Nolan alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Nolan reported to the medical bay for his shift, hoping to lose himself in routine tasks. Instead, he found Dr. Elena Rodriguez waiting for him, her expression a mix of concern and scientific curiosity. Nolan, she said, gesturing him into a private examination room. We need to talk about what happened on the asteroid. He sighed, resigned to the inevitable. News travels fast, I guess. Faster than light on this station, Elena replied wryly. She activated a medical scanner, running it over Nolan's body. I'm concerned about potential health risks associated with your encounter. Interspecies intimate contact is largely uncharted territory, medically speaking. Nolan felt his face flush as Elena continued her examination, asking pointed questions about his physical state and any unusual symptoms. As the scanner beeped its completion, her brow furrowed. This is interesting, she muttered, studying the results. I'm detecting some unusual changes in your biochemistry. Nothing immediately alarming, but definitely outside normal human parameters. What kind of changes? Nolan asked, a note of worry creeping into his voice. Elena shook her head. It's too soon to say for certain, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's related to exposure to NASAT pheromones. We'll need to monitor you closely over the coming days. As Nolan left the medical bay, his mind whirling with this new information, he nearly collided with a group of his human colleagues. Their conversation died abruptly as they noticed him, replaced by an awkward silence. Hey, Thompson, one of them finally spoke up. Is it true what they're saying? About you and the NASAT? Nolan opened his mouth to respond, but another cut in before he could speak. Are they really as flexible as the rumors say? Enough! Nolan snapped, pushing past them. He could feel their eyes on his back as he strode away, their whispers following him down the corridor. As he rounded a corner, he nearly ran into Stella. She was flanked by two other NASAT, their exoskeletons pulsing with colors Nolan couldn't interpret. Stella's antennae twitched in what he now recognized as embarrassment. Nolan, she clicked softly. I hope you are well. He nodded stiffly, acutely aware of the watching NASAT. Fine, thank you. And you? Before Stella could respond, one of her companions chittered something in their native language. Stella's exoskeleton flashed a deep, angry red, and she replied sharply. The other NASAT recoiled slightly, their antennae quivering. Nolan wanted to ask what had been said, to reach out and comfort Stella, but he knew he couldn't. Not here, not now. With a final, longing look, he moved past them, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. As he continued down the corridor, the station's intercom system crackled to life. Captain Voss's voice echoed through the hallways, his tone urgent. All senior staff report to the command center immediately. We have a situation. Nolan quickened his pace, heart racing. As he entered the command center, he saw Stella already there, her exoskeleton pulsing with agitated colors. Captain Voss stood before a large holographic display, his face grim. We've detected a series of system malfunctions across the station, Voss announced as the room filled. Critical systems are experiencing intermittent failures. Engineering teams are working to isolate the cause, but so far they've come up empty. Nolan felt the weight of suspicious glances from his colleagues. A murmur ran through the assembled crew, and he caught snatches of whispered conversations. Ever since they... unnatural, affecting the station somehow? Captain Voss raised his hand for silence. I know there are rumors circulating about recent events. Let me be clear. We deal in facts, not speculation. Thompson, Chakar, given your combined expertise, I'm assigning you to lead the investigation into these malfunctions. Nolan's eyes met Stella's across the room. Despite the controversy surrounding them, despite the orders to maintain distance, they were being thrown together once again. As they moved to access a nearby console, Nolan could feel the eyes of the entire command staff upon them. The sweet scent of Stella's pheromones filled his nostrils as they began to work, bringing back vivid memories of their encounter on the asteroid. Nolan forced himself to focus on the task at hand, pushing aside the conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. As they dove into the station's systems, searching for the source of the malfunctions, Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a technical glitch. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he and Stella were at the center of it all. With the ethics committee's arrival looming and the station's systems failing around them, Nolan knew that the next 48 hours would be crucial, not just for him and Stella, but for the future of human-Nasat relations. As they worked side by side, the tension between them palpable, Nolan couldn't help but wonder, had their moment of passion on the asteroid set in motion, events that would change the course of interstellar cooperation forever? As Nolan and Stella worked side by side, the tension between them palpable, a piercing alarm shattered the uneasy silence of the command center. Red warning lights flashed across every console, bathing the room in an ominous glow. "What's happening?" Captain Voss demanded, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of alerts. Nolan's fingers flew across the keyboard, his eyes scanning rapidly through scrolling lines of data. "It's not just system malfunctions, sir. We're dealing with a full-scale virus attack. It's triggering a cascade failure in the station's primary systems." Stella's antennae twitched rapidly as she processed the incoming data. Life support, artificial gravity, and radiation shielding are all failing simultaneously, she clicked, her exoskeleton pulsing with alarmed hues. Voss's face hardened as he made a swift decision. Initiate emergency protocols. All non-essential personnel are to evacuate to the emergency shuttles immediately. As crew members rushed to comply with the captain's orders, Nolan exchanged a meaningful look with Stella. Without hesitation, they both stepped forward. "Captain," Nolan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, "Stella and I volunteer to stay behind. We might be able to neutralize the virus from the central computer core." Voss nodded grimly. "Do what you can, but if things get too dicey, I want you both on the last shuttle out. Understood?" They acknowledged the order and sprinted from the command center, their footsteps echoing through the increasingly unstable station. As they ran, Nolan felt the artificial gravity fluctuate, causing his stomach to lurch. The air grew thin and acrid, a clear sign that the life support systems were failing. Reaching the central computer core, they found the room bathed in the eerie blue glow of emergency lighting. Nolan immediately plugged into a terminal, his fingers dancing across the interface as he delved into the station's code. "This virus is like nothing I've ever seen," he muttered, brow furrowed in concentration. "It's adaptive, evolving to counter our security protocols faster than we can implement them." Stella interfaced with another terminal, her compound eyes rapidly processing the data streams. "I'm detecting a pattern in the virus's behavior. It bears similarities to Nasat encryption algorithms, but with human coding structures." As they worked feverishly to isolate the virus, Nolan noticed a strange tingling sensation spreading across his skin. He glanced down and froze, his eyes widening in shock. A faint blue tinge was creeping across his forearms, barely visible in the dim light. "Stella," he called out, his voice tight with concern. "Are you feeling different?" The Nasat turned to face him, her movements unusually stiff. "My exoskeleton," she clicked softly. "It's changing, softening in places. Before they could discuss the implications of these bizarre symptoms, Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice crackled over their comm units. Nolan, Stella, I've been monitoring your vital signs remotely. Your physiologies are undergoing some kind of unprecedented biochemical reaction. It seems your encounter on the asteroid has triggered adaptive changes in both of your bodies. Nolan opened his mouth to respond, but a violent shudder ran through the station, nearly knocking him off his feet. We'll have to worry about that later, Doc, he said, regaining his balance. Right now, we need to stop this virus before the whole station tears itself apart. As they redoubled their efforts, Nolan noticed something peculiar. Despite the dire circumstances and the strange changes affecting their bodies, he and Stella were working together with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, each anticipating the other's actions before they occurred. Suddenly, Nolan's eyes lit up. I've found something. There's a weakness in the virus's code structure. If we can exploit it, we might be able to neutralize the threat. Stella leaned in to examine his findings, her antennae quivering with excitement. You're right, but there's a problem. Exploiting this weakness would require directly interfacing with the station's neural network. For a human, that kind of connection could be fatal. Nolan's heart sank, but Stella continued, her voice taking on a determined timbre. However, my adapted physiology might allow me to make the connection safely. I volunteer to attempt the procedure. Stella, no! Nolan protested, grabbing her arm. It's too dangerous. We don't know what it could do to you. She placed a limb gently on his hand, her compound eyes meeting his gaze. We don't have a choice, Nolan. It's the only way to save the station and everyone on it. Reluctantly, Nolan nodded and began preparing the neural interface. As he worked, the station's systems continued to deteriorate around them. Sparks flew from overloading circuits, and the air grew thinner with each passing minute. Finally, everything was ready. Stella positioned herself in front of the main interface panel, her exoskeleton pulsing with a mix of dedication and apprehension. Nolan stood nearby, ready to monitor her vital signs and provide whatever support he could. Ready? He asked, his hand hovering over the activation switch. Stella's antennae twitched in affirmation. Ready. Nolan flipped the switch, and Stella's body went rigid as her consciousness merged with the station's systems. Her compound eyes glazed over, reflecting cascading streams of data. Nolan watched in awe as she battled the virus on a virtual plane, her mind racing through data streams and firewalls at incredible speeds. Through their newfound empathic link, Nolan could sense Stella's progress. He fed her information and support, guiding her through the labyrinthine structure of the station's neural network. Together, they cornered the virus in the tertiary backup systems. Now, Stella, Nolan called out, both aloud and through their mental connection. Isolate and delete the malicious code. With a final push of effort, Stella executed the command. The virus's presence vanished from the system, and the station's alarms fell silent. Emergency lighting flickered and died, replaced by the steady glow of normal illumination. As the station's systems came back online, Stella's connection to the neural network severed. Her exoskeleton pulsed weakly with exhaustion as she collapsed into Nolan's waiting arms. We did it, she clicked softly, her antennae drooping with fatigue. Nolan held her close, acutely aware of the changes in both their bodies, but too relieved to care. Yes, we did. Together. As they basked in their victory, neither of them noticed the flashing light on a nearby console. An incoming transmission from a high-priority channel. The message's header read, Urgent, arrival of Dr. Zixval, xenobiology specialist. Their moment of triumph was short-lived, as new challenges loomed on the horizon. The station was safe for now, but the mystery of their changing bodies and the implications of their deepening bond were just beginning to unfold. As Nolan helped Stella to her feet, the command center's intercom crackled to life. Thompson, Chakur, report to the medical bay immediately, Captain Voss's voice commanded, tension evident in his tone. Exchanging puzzled glances, Nolan and Stella made their way through the station's corridors. The recent crisis had left its mark. Repair crews scrambled to fix damaged systems, and the air still carried a faint scent of ozone from overloaded circuits. As they entered the medical bay, they found it transformed. Equipment had been rearranged and new devices lined the walls. Captain Voss stood beside two unfamiliar figures, Dr. Elena Rodriguez and a tall, willowy alien with iridescent scales and large multifaceted eyes. "Nolan, Stella, this is Dr. Zix Vale," Voss introduced, his expression grave. "She's a xenobiology specialist who's just arrived to assist with your situation." Dr. Zix Vale's eyes flickered with interest as she observed them. "Fascinating," she murmured, her voice a melodic trill. "The reports hardly do justice to the extent of your physiological changes." Nolan felt a wave of unease wash over him. "Changes? What changes?" Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her face a mix of concern and scientific curiosity. "Your encounter on the asteroid and subsequent exposure to the station's systems have triggered unprecedented alterations in both your biologies. We need to run a series of tests to understand the full extent of these transformations." Stella's exoskeleton pulsed with agitation. "Is this necessary? We just saved the station. Surely we've earned some rest." "I'm afraid this can't wait," Captain Voss said firmly. "The potential security implications of your condition are too significant to ignore. I'm ordering you both to undergo these tests." Reluctantly, Nolan and Stella agreed. Over the next several hours, they were subjected to a battery of examinations. Blood samples were drawn, brain scans were performed, and their bodies were analyzed down to the cellular level. As the tests progressed, the changes became increasingly apparent. Nolan watched in astonishment as his skin began to emit a faint, blue-green glow, reminiscent of Stella's bioluminescent exoskeleton. Stella, in turn, found her limbs becoming more flexible and articulated, allowing her to manipulate objects with a dexterity she'd never before possessed. "Extraordinary," Dr. Zixval breathed, examining a holographic display of their cellular structures. "Their DNA is reconfiguring itself, creating a hybrid genome that incorporates elements of both human and Nasat biology." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her eyes wide with amazement. "It's as if their bodies are evolving in real time, adapting to complement each other's strengths." As word of their condition spread throughout the station, Nolan and Stella found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny. Crew members whispered in corridors, some fascinated, others wary. The weight of their stares was palpable, a constant reminder of how far they now stood from their respective species. Captain Voss, ever mindful of the station's security, made a difficult decision. "I'm placing you both in quarantine," he announced, his voice heavy with regret. "We've prepared a specialized habitat module where we can continue to monitor your condition while ensuring the safety of the crew." Nolan opened his mouth to protest, but Stella placed a gentle limb on his arm. Through their deepening bond, he sensed her resignation and understanding. They had no choice but to comply. The habitat module was spacious but sterile, a self-contained environment that would serve as their home for the foreseeable future. As the airlock sealed behind them, Nolan felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over him. Stella's presence beside him was the only comfort in their isolation. Days passed, and their connection grew stronger. Nolan found himself instinctively understanding Stella's clicks and color changes without the need for translation. Stella, in turn, began to grasp the nuances of human facial expressions and body language with uncanny accuracy. One morning, as Nolan awoke from a fitful sleep, he heard Stella's voice in his mind, clear as day. "Nolan, can you hear me?" He sat bolt upright, heart racing. "Stella? How?" Her antennae twitched with excitement. "I don't know, I just thought at you, and you responded." They spent hours exploring this new ability, pushing the limits of their telepathic connection. They discovered they could share not just thoughts, but sensations and emotions, their minds intertwining in ways that defied conventional understanding. Meanwhile, beyond the confines of their quarantine, the station buzzed with activity. Captain Voss had received alarming intelligence reports warning of an imminent attack by the purity of form extremists. Security measures were tightened, and all incoming ships were subjected to rigorous screening protocols. Dr. Zixval, intrigued by the potential applications of Nolan and Stella's hybrid physiology, approached Captain Voss with a daring proposal. Their unique nervous systems could potentially interface directly with the station's defense systems, she explained, her scales shimmering with excitement. It could provide an unprecedented level of control and responsiveness. Voss frowned, considering the implications. And the risks? Dr. Rodriguez stepped in, her voice filled with concern. The strain on their bodies could be significant. We don't fully understand the long-term effects of their transformation, let alone the impact of such an intensive neural connection. Despite the ethical concerns raised by some crew members, Voss saw the potential benefits outweighing the risks. With the threat of attack looming, he authorized the experiment. Nolan and Stella were brought to the central computer core, where a complex array of neural interfaces awaited them. As the technicians attached the electrodes to their bodies, Nolan felt a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through him. "Are you ready?" he asked Stella, squeezing her limb gently. Her exoskeleton pulsed with persistence. "Together," she replied, both aloud and in his mind. As the neural link activated, Nolan gasped. His consciousness expanded, merging with Stella's and then beyond, into the vast digital architecture of the station itself. Every system, every sensor, every line of code became an extension of their shared mind. In that moment of profound connection, neither of them noticed the flashing alert on a nearby console, warning of an unauthorized access attempt in the maintenance sector. The battle for the station's survival had begun, and Nolan and Stella found themselves at its very heart, their hybrid minds racing to confront a threat they had yet to fully comprehend. The vast network of the station's systems stretched before them like an endless digital landscape, teeming with data streams and pulsing with energy. But as they delved deeper into the station's core, something began to change. Nolan felt a strange tingling sensation spreading across his skin, starting at the points where the neural interfaces connected to his body. He tried to look down at his hands, but his physical senses were overwhelmed by the digital realm surrounding him. Stella's voice echoed in his mind, tinged with alarm. "Nolan, something's happening to us. I can feel it." Before he could respond, a searing pain shot through his body. In the physical world, Dr. Rodriguez's eyes widened in shock as she watched the monitors displaying Nolan and Stella's vital signs. "Captain, we have a problem," she called out urgently. "Their bodies are undergoing rapid cellular changes. It's like their hybridization is accelerating exponentially." Dr. Zixval leaned in, her multifaceted eyes flickering with intense interest. "Fascinating. It appears the neural interface is catalyzing their transformation." On the medical bay's observation screens, Nolan's skin began to take on a glossy, chitinous texture, reminiscent of Stella's exoskeleton. Meanwhile, Stella's limbs started to elongate and reshape, becoming more human-like in structure. Captain Voss watched the transformation with growing concern. "Can we stop it?" Dr. Rodriguez shook her head. "I'm not sure. The process seems to be self-sustaining now. If we disconnect them, we might cause irreparable damage." As the medical team grappled with the situation, alarms blared throughout the station. Security Officer Liu's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we've detected multiple unauthorized access attempts in the maintenance sector. It's Graves. He's making his move." Voss's face hardened. He was caught between two crises, both with potentially catastrophic consequences. After a moment's hesitation, he made his decision. "Initiate a complete shutdown of all non-essential systems," he ordered. "We need to isolate that virus and reduce the strain on Nolan and Stella." As the command was carried out, large sections of the station plunged into darkness. The artificial gravity flickered and died in multiple areas, leaving crew members floating helplessly in the suddenly weightless environment. Panic spread quickly among the station's inhabitants. In the digital realm, Nolan and Stella sensed the change immediately. The vast landscape around them began to contract, systems going dark one by one. They felt the virus like a malevolent presence being cornered. "We've got it trapped," Nolan communicated to Stella. "Let's finish this." They focused their hybrid minds on the isolated section of the network where the virus now lurked. But as they prepared to strike, a new threat emerged. In the physical world, Marcus Graves took advantage of the chaos caused by the shutdown. He moved swiftly through the darkened corridors, his steps sure and purposeful. Reaching a maintenance terminal, he quickly bypassed the security protocols and gained access to the backup life support systems. With a few keystrokes, Graves initiated a shutdown sequence for the remaining life support. Then he turned his attention to the main airlock controls. His fingers flew over the keypad as he worked to override the safety protocols. Back in the digital realm, Nolan and Stella suddenly became aware of the new danger. They sensed the life support systems failing and the airlock controls being tampered with. "He's trying to decompress the station," Stella realized with horror. Without hesitation, they diverted their focus from the virus to address this more immediate threat. Using their enhanced abilities, they reached out through the station's systems, locking down the airlocks and rerouting emergency power to critical life support functions. The effort was immense. Nolan felt as if his very essence was being stretched to its limits. Beside him, he sensed Stella's consciousness flickering, struggling to maintain cohesion. In the medical bay, the monitoring equipment screamed with warnings. Dr. Rodriguez watched in alarm as Nolan and Stella's vital signs began to fluctuate wildly. "Their hybrid physiology is reaching its limit," she reported, her voice tight with concern. "If we don't disconnect them soon, we might lose them entirely." But even as she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. On the observation screens, Nolan and Stella's bodies started to merge with the station's hardware. Flesh intertwined with circuitry, and metal fused with organic matter. Dr. Zixval's eyes widened in astonishment. "Incredible! They're becoming one with the station itself." Captain Voss looked on in a mixture of awe and horror. The implications of what he was witnessing were staggering. But before he could fully process it, another crisis demanded his attention. The station shuddered violently as a series of explosions rocked its outer hull. Liu's voice came over the intercom once more, filled with urgency. "Captain, we're under attack. Multiple ships have emerged from the asteroid field. They're using some kind of energy weapons we've never seen before." Voss's mind raced. The purity of form extremists had launched their assault, catching the station at its most vulnerable moment. With Nolan and Stella locked in their hybrid state and Graves still at large, the station's defenses were severely compromised. As the attack intensified, the captain found himself facing an impossible choice. Should he risk separating Nolan and Stella, potentially saving their individual identities, but losing their incredible defensive capabilities? Or should he allow their hybridization to continue, possibly creating a new form of life at the cost of their humanity? The station shuddered again under another barrage of weapons fire. Time was running out, and the fate of everyone aboard hung in the balance. Captain Voss steeled himself, knowing that whatever decision he made would have far-reaching consequences for the future of human-Nasat relations and the very nature of life in space. The cosmos itself. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. "Dr. Rodriguez," Voss called out, his voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and panicked voices. "Proceed with the stabilization procedure. We need to preserve Nolan and Stella's consciousnesses while maintaining their connection to our systems." The doctor nodded grimly, her fingers flying over the medical console as she prepared a series of bioneural injections. Dr. Zixval moved to assist, her scales shimmering with nervous energy as she calibrated the equipment. "Initiating stabilization sequence," Dr. Rodriguez announced, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. The medical bay hummed with energy as the injections were administered through the neural interfaces still connected to Nolan and Stella's hybrid forms. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, with a suddenness that made everyone flinch, Nolan and Stella's bodies began to shift and reform. Their flesh rippled and flowed like liquid metal, settling into a new configuration that blended human and Nasat characteristics in ways that defied easy description. Their skin took on a metallic sheen, reflecting the harsh glare of the medical bay's emergency lighting. Their limbs elongated and reshaped, developing multiple joints that allowed for an impossible range of motion. As the transformation slowed, Nolan's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that swirled with complex circuit-like patterns. "We are still here," he said, his voice a strange harmony of human speech and nasat clicks. Stella's antennae twitched, and her newly formed lips curved into a smile. "We are one, yet separate," she added, her words overlapping with Nolan's in perfect synchronization. Before anyone could react to this extraordinary development, the station shuddered violently. Sparks erupted from a nearby console as the sound of tearing metal echoed through the corridors. "Captain," Liu's voice crackled over the intercom, "we've cornered Graves near the central computer core, but he's activated some kind of device. We're detecting a massive surge of nanotech activity throughout the station." Voss's blood ran cold. "Nolan, Stella, can you sense what's happening?" The hybrid couple's eyes unfocused for a moment as they reached out through their connection to the station's systems. "Nanobots," they said in unison, their voices tinged with alarm. "They're disassembling critical systems at an alarming rate." Without hesitation, Nolan and Stella's bodies began to shift once more. Tendrils of their hybrid flesh extended outward, interfacing directly with the station's hardware. Their faces contorted with concentration as they fought to contain the nanobot threat. "We're activating emergency containment protocols," Nolan explained, his voice strained, "sealing off affected sections to slow the spread." Alarms blared as bulkheads slammed shut throughout the station. On the main display, entire sections of the schematic blinked red, indicating sealed areas. "Captain," Stella added, her antennae quivering with distress, "we've had to trap several crew members in the sealed sections. Life support in those areas is failing." Before Voss could respond, the station rocked with an impact that sent everyone stumbling. The organic shield that had formed around the station's exterior rippled visibly on the external cameras. "The Purity of Form fleet has begun its attack," Liu reported, her voice tight with tension. "They're using their ships as projectiles." Voss steadied himself against a console, his mind racing. "Nolan, Stella, can you reinforce the shield?" The hybrid couple's brows furrowed in concentration. "We're trying," Nolan replied, "but the nanobots are interfering with our control over the station's systems." Dr. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring Nolan and Stella's vital signs, suddenly perked up. "Captain, I've discovered something extraordinary. The hybridization process has given them limited control over their own cellular structure. They might be able to generate antibodies to neutralize the nanobots." A spark of hope ignited in Voss's chest, but it was quickly tempered by Dr. Rodriguez's next words. "However," she continued, her expression grave, "producing enough antibodies to save the station would require them to sacrifice a significant portion of their newly stabilized hybrid mass. The process could be dangerous." The implications hung heavy in the air. Before anyone could discuss the possibility further, the station shuddered again as another kamikaze ship impacted the organic shield. "Captain," Liu's voice cut through the chaos once more, "we've subdued Graves, but he claims there's a shutdown code for the nanobots. It's known only to the Purity of Form leadership." Voss's eyes narrowed. He turned to Nolan and Stella, their hybrid forms still intertwined with the station's systems. "Can you hold off the nanobots long enough for us to extract the code from Graves?" The couple exchanged a look, their circuit-patterned eyes flickering with unspoken communication. "We are unsure," Stella replied, her voice wavering. "The nanobots are adapting quickly. We may need to take more drastic action." As if to emphasize her point, a series of small explosions echoed through the station. On the main display, fractures began to appear in the outer hull, creeping outward like spiderwebs. "The organic shield can't withstand much more of this bombardment," Nolan added, his voice tight with strain. Dr. Zixval, who had been furiously working at a nearby console, suddenly looked up. "I may have a solution," she announced, her multifaceted eyes gleaming with intensity. "We could use the station's experimental matter replication technology to reproduce Nolan and Stella's hybrid cellular structure. This would allow them to generate the necessary antibodies without sacrificing their own mass." A flicker of hope passed across Voss's face, but it quickly faded as Dr. Zixval continued. "However," she said, her voice grave, "the process would require diverting power from life support systems. It would put the remaining crew at significant risk." As Voss grappled with this impossible choice, his comm unit crackled to life. The stern voice of Admiral Cheng, his superior at United Earth Command, filled the air. "Captain Voss, this is a direct order from Earth," the Admiral's voice boomed. "You are to preserve Nolan and Stella at all costs. Their hybrid form represents a scientific and strategic asset of incalculable value. Do you understand?" Voss's lips pursed as he looked around the room. Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Zixval watched him with a mixture of concern and anticipation. On the main display, the station's schematic pulsed with warnings as systems continued to fail. And at the center of it all, Nolan and Stella's hybrid forms trembled with the effort of holding the station together. Before Voss could respond, Nolan and Stella's eyes suddenly widened in unison. Without a word, their bodies began to change once more. Tendrils of their hybrid flesh extended outward, snaking through the station's corridors with alarming speed. "What are you doing?" Voss demanded, watching in astonishment as the organic network spread throughout the station. "We're taking action," Nolan and Stella replied in perfect synchronization, their voices echoing strangely through the station's communication systems. "Our hybrid structure can seek out and neutralize the nanobots directly." As their consciousness spread throughout the station, Nolan and Stella's physical forms began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing second. They were sacrificing their newly stabilized bodies to save the station and its crew. Voss watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the hybrid network pulsed with energy, engaging the nanobots in a microscopic battle that spanned the entire station. Alarms continued to blare as the Purity of Form fleet prepared for another assault, and the countdown to total life support failure ticked inexorably downward. The fate of the station, its crew, and the future of human-Nasat relations hung in the balance, and Captain Voss found himself caught between his duty to Earth, his responsibility to his crew, and the awe-inspiring sacrifice of Nolan and Stella. With time running out and threats mounting on all sides, he knew that his next decision would shape the course of history. The captain's thoughts were interrupted as Nolan and Stella's translucent forms began to pulse with an intense, otherworldly light. "Captain," they spoke in unison, their voices echoing through the station's communication systems. "We've engaged the nanobots directly, but the strain, it's overwhelming." Voss watched in awe as tendrils of hybrid flesh snaked through the corridors, seeking out and neutralizing the microscopic threats. The station's schematic on the main display shifted rapidly, areas once red with warning now fading to a cautious yellow. But as the hybrid network expanded, Nolan and Stella's physical forms became increasingly insubstantial. Their features blurred, individual characteristics melting away as their consciousness spread thin across the station's vast expanse. "We're losing them," Dr. Rodriguez called out, her eyes fixed on a monitor displaying rapidly fluctuating biometric data. "Their neural patterns are destabilizing. If this continues, we may not be able to reconstitute their individual identities." Voss's eyebrows furrowed. He turned to the security feed showing Marcus Graves in custody. "Bring him to me, now." Within minutes, a battered and restrained Graves was escorted into the command center. Voss approached him, eyes blazing with hardly restrained fury. "The shutdown code for the nanobots. Now!" Graves smirked, despite his predicament. "And why would I do that?" The station shuddered violently, and Voss grabbed the man by his collar. "Because if you don't, none of us will survive to debate the purity of anything." Something in the captain's tone must have reached Graves. His smug expression faltered. "Fine, but you should know, activating the shutdown sequence will trigger a failsafe. The remaining nanobots will self-destruct. It could damage critical systems." Voss released him, turning to assess the situation. The hybrid network continued to spread, but Nolan and Stella's translucent forms were now barely visible, their voices a faint whisper in the station's systems. "Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Zixval," Voss called out. "We need a way to stabilize them." The two scientists exchanged a look before Dr. Zixval's multifaceted eyes lit up. "A targeted electromagnetic pulse," she said, her claws flying over a nearby console. "We can halt the uncontrolled spread without damaging the station's systems." "Do it," Voss ordered. As the scientists worked, Voss turned back to Graves. "The code! Now!" Graves hesitated, then rattled off a string of alphanumeric characters. Voss relayed them to Liu, who stood ready at the central computer core. "Pulse ready?" Dr. Rodriguez announced. Voss took a deep breath. "Initiate the pulse. Liu, stand by to enter the shutdown code on my mark." The air crackled with energy as the electromagnetic pulse swept through the station. The hybrid network's expansion halted abruptly, its tendrils freezing in place. Nolan and Stella's faint forms flickered, then stabilized, though they remained in a semi-conscious state. "Now, Liu, enter the code." As the shutdown sequence activated, a series of small explosions rippled through the station. Warning klaxons blared as systems fluctuated, but the immediate threat of disassembly subsided. The moment of relief was short-lived. The external cameras showed 3 massive ships from the Purity of Form fleet accelerating toward the station, their hulls packed with explosives. "Kamikaze run," Voss breathed, his blood running cold. The organic shield, already weakened, began to buckle under the renewed assault. Voss watched in horror as the first ship drew closer, bracing for impact. Suddenly, the hybrid material covering the station's interior pulsed with renewed energy. The organic shield began to reshape itself, extending massive tentacle-like structures into space. "Incredible," Dr. Zixval whispered, her scales shimmering with excitement. "They're adapting." The hybrid tentacles reached out, grasping 2 of the incoming ships and altering their trajectories just enough to miss the station. But the third ship continued its collision course. In that moment, Nolan and Stella's semi-conscious forms flickered with intense light. Their voices, stronger now, echoed through the station, redirecting power, reinforcing shield. The organic material at the point of imminent impact thickened, drawing energy from throughout the station. As the kamikaze vessel struck, the collision sent shockwaves through the entire structure. Sparks flew from consoles, and crew members were thrown to the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, Voss thought the shield would fail. But when the dust settled, he saw that while the damage was extensive, the station had survived. The remaining Purity of Form ships, their will broken by the station's incredible display of adaptive defense, began to retreat. Inside, chaos reigned as crew members struggled to assess the damage and tend to the injured. As emergency teams worked to stabilize critical systems, Voss surveyed the changed landscape of his command. Large sections of the interior were now covered in pulsing, biomechanical hybrid material. The organic shield on the exterior had become a permanent feature, slowly knitting itself back together. Dr. Rodriguez approached, her face a mix of awe and concern. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, leading him to a console displaying readings from the hybrid material. "It's not just a passive structure," she explained, pointing to patterns in the data. "It's actively problem-solving, repairing itself and the station's systems. I think Nolan and Stella are still in there, their consciousness fragmented but present." Before Voss could respond, a priority communication from Earth flashed on the main screen. As he read the message, his heart sank. The United Earth government was declaring the station a restricted zone, ordering an immediate quarantine. A specialized scientific team was being dispatched to study the unprecedented fusion of human, nasat, and machine. Voss looked around at his transformed command center, at the pulsing hybrid material that now encased much of the station. He thought of Nolan and Stella, their sacrifice and transformation, and the countless challenges that lay ahead. The station had survived, but at what cost? And what would become of this new hybrid entity they had created? As Voss contemplated these questions, he knew that the true test of his leadership was only just beginning. As the gravity of the situation settled over the command center, the station's systems began to act erratically. Consoles flickered, lights dimmed and brightened in random patterns, and a low hum resonated through the structure. "Captain," Dr. Rodriguez called out, her eyes wide with concern, "the hybrid material is integrating further into our systems. It's causing power fluctuations throughout the station." Voss strode to her console, watching as diagrams of the station's power grid flashed with warnings. "Can you stabilize it?" "I'm trying, but..." Her words were cut off as a nearby panel exploded in a shower of sparks, forcing her to duck. "All personnel, this is Captain Voss," he announced over the station-wide comm. "We are initiating an emergency evacuation. Proceed to your designated escape pods immediately." As the alarm klaxons blared, crew members rushed through the corridors. The hybrid material pulsed and shifted, sometimes blocking paths and forcing people to find alternate routes. Voss coordinated the evacuation from the command center, watching as escape pod after escape pod launched into space. "Captain," Liu called out, "we've got another problem. Marcus Graves has escaped custody in the chaos." Voss cursed under his breath. "Security teams, be on high alert. Graves is loose on the station." As the last of the non-essential personnel evacuated, Voss gathered his remaining team. Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Zixval, Liu, and a handful of security officers stood ready for orders. "We're staying behind to manage critical systems and monitor the hybrid entity's development," Voss explained. "Dr. Rodriguez, what's our status?" The scientist's fingers flew over her console. "The hybrid material is attempting to access our mainframe. I think Nolan and Stella are trying to reconstitute themselves within our systems." As if in response to her words, the hybrid material rippled, forming vaguely humanoid shapes that dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared. The station groaned, metal twisting as the organic material expanded its reach. "Captain," Liu shouted, pointing at a security feed, "Graves is in life support. He's sabotaging the systems." Voss's expression resolute. "We need to stop him. Liu, Zixval, you're with me. Rodriguez, keep working on stabilizing the hybrid entity." As they moved through the station, the environment around them shifted and changed. Corridors reshaped themselves, forcing the team to adapt their route constantly. Suddenly, a fully formed humanoid construct emerged from the wall, its features a bizarre blend of Nolan and Stella. "Help us," it spoke, its voice a discordant mix of the two it represented before dissolving back into the hybrid mass. They reached life support to find Graves hunched over a control panel, his hands working furiously to override safety protocols. Voss raised his weapon. "Step away from the console, Graves." The saboteur spun, a manic gleam in his eyes. "You don't understand. This abomination can't be allowed to exist." Before Voss could respond, tendrils of hybrid material snaked out, wrapping around Graves's legs. He screamed, trying to break free, but the material pulled him into the wall, absorbing him completely. "Captain," Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the comm, "I've made a breakthrough. We can stabilize the situation by fully merging Nolan and Stella's consciousness with the station's AI, but it might erase their individual identities completely." Voss looked at his team, then at the pulsing hybrid material surrounding them. "Do it, Doctor. It's our only chance." As Rodriguez initiated the merger, the station shuddered violently. Alarms blared as systems went haywire. The hybrid material glowed intensely, patterns of light racing across its surface. Suddenly, everything went dark. For a heart-stopping moment, there was absolute silence. Then the station hummed back to life, systems reactivating with unprecedented efficiency. A voice, neither Nolan's nor Stella's, but somehow both, echoed through the station. "We are stabilized, threat neutralized, but our integration is incomplete. We require time to understand our new existence." As the immediate crisis passed, Voss and his team regrouped in the command center. The station had fundamentally changed, its every surface now a blend of technology and organic material that pulsed with life. "Captain," Liu called out, "we're receiving a transmission. It's the scientific team from Earth. They're requesting permission to dock." Voss took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. "Grant them access. It's time to face the consequences of what we've created here." As the docking procedures began, Voss watched the approaching ship on the main screen. He knew that the arrival of Dr. Alara Vex and her team would mark the beginning of a new chapter in this extraordinary saga. The transformed station, now a living entity born from the union of human, Nasat, and machine, represented a new frontier in the exploration of life itself. The docking clamps engaged with a resounding thud, and Voss straightened his uniform. Whatever came next, he knew that the future of human-Nasat relations, and perhaps the very nature of consciousness itself, would be forever altered by the events that had transpired on this station. Station. The docking procedure completed with a series of metallic clanks, and Voss took a deep breath, steeling himself for the encounter to come. As the airlock cycled open, Dr. Alara Vex emerged, followed by her team of scientists. Their eyes widened as they took in the transformed interior of the station, organic tendrils pulsing with bioluminescent light along the walls. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Vex," Voss said, extending his hand. "I'm afraid the station you've come to study has changed quite dramatically since our last communication." Before Dr. Vex could respond, a voice resonated through the corridor, a perfect blend of Nolan and Stella's tones. "Greetings, Dr. Vex and team. We welcome you to our new form." Dr. Vex's jaw dropped. "Fascinating," she whispered, her eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Captain Voss, I believe you have quite a story to tell us." Voss nodded grimly. "Indeed, Doctor. If you'll follow me to the central hub, I'll brief you on the extraordinary events that have transpired here." As they walked, the organic corridors seemed to shift and pulse, guiding them toward their destination. Dr. Vex's team murmured in awe, their hands hovering near the walls, itching to take samples and readings. In the central hub, Voss recounted the harrowing tale of the station's transformation, the merging of Nolan and Stella with the AI, and the creation of the hybrid entity. Dr. Vex listened intently, her expression a mix of scientific curiosity and concern. "This is unprecedented," she said when Voss finished. "We need to establish communication protocols immediately. The potential here is staggering." Over the next few hours, Dr. Vex and her team set up a series of experiments, attempting to interface with the hybrid entity. They used a combination of advanced neural imaging technology and adaptive algorithms to interpret the entity's unique form of communication. As they worked, biomechanical constructs began to form from the walls, humanoid shapes that were a perfect blend of human and Nasat physiology. These constructs moved with fluid grace, assisting the scientists and interacting with the crew. "Captain," Liu called out, his voice tense, "we're picking up multiple ships on long-range scanners. It's a military task force from Earth." Voss's stomach dropped. "Hail them," he ordered, moving to the communications console. Admiral Hawthorne's stern face appeared on the screen. "Captain Voss, this is Admiral Hawthorne of the United Earth Government. We are here to establish a quarantine zone around your station. Prepare to be boarded for security inspection." "Admiral," Voss replied, keeping his voice steady, "I must advise against any forceful action. The situation here is delicate and potentially volatile. We have a team of scientists on board studying a new form of life. Any aggressive moves could jeopardize their work and potentially endanger everyone on this station." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You have 1 hour to grant us access, Captain. If you fail to comply, we will be forced to take more direct action." As the transmission cut off, Voss turned to Dr. Vex. "Doctor, we need results, and we need them fast. Anything you can give me to convince the Admiral that we're not a threat." Dr. Vex nodded, her team already racing back to their equipment. "We've made some progress. The hybrid entity, it's not just a single consciousness. We're detecting remnants of Nolan and Stella's individual minds. If we can isolate them, communicate with them directly." A series of alarms suddenly blared through the station. The hybrid material covering the walls pulsed rapidly, and the biomechanical constructs began to move with increased urgency. "What's happening?" Voss demanded. One of Dr. Vex's assistants looked up from a console, his face pale. "The hybrid entity is evolving at an exponential rate. It's trying to separate Nolan and Stella's consciousness from its own." Dr. Vex's eyes widened. "This could be our chance, Captain. If we can successfully separate them, it might prove to Admiral Hawthorne that we're not dealing with some mindless, dangerous entity." Voss nodded, his mind racing. "What do you need?" "Energy," Dr. Vex replied. "An enormous amount. The separation process will put an incredible strain on the station's systems." As if in response, the hybrid entity's voice echoed through the hub. "We are prepared to attempt the separation. But be warned, the process is not without risk. Failure could result in the loss of all consciousness within the system. Voss looked at the countdown timer showing Admiral Hawthorne's deadline. They were running out of options and time. "Do it," he ordered. "Divert all non-essential power to Dr. Vex's team. I'll try to buy us more time with the Admiral." As the scientists rushed to prepare for the separation procedure, Voss opened a channel to the military fleet. "Admiral Hawthorne, I request a brief extension of your deadline. We are in the middle of a delicate procedure that could willpower this situation peacefully." The Admiral's face was a mask of skepticism, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded. "You have 30 additional minutes, Captain, not a second more." The separation process began, and immediately the station groaned under the strain. Lights flickered, and the organic shell covering the exterior rippled violently, emitting pulses of energy that played havoc with the military fleet's sensors. In the central hub, the biomechanical constructs converged, their forms melding together into a swirling vortex of matter and energy. Dr. Vex and her team worked feverishly at their consoles, trying to stabilize the process as alarms blared, warning of system overloads. "Power levels are critical," Liu shouted over the din. "We're risking a core breach." Voss watched as 3 distinct energy signatures began to emerge from the swirling mass. The hybrid entity's voice, now strained and fluctuating, announced, "Separation, nearly complete. Final power surge required." Voss knew the risk, but he also knew this was their only chance. "Do it," he ordered. "Divert emergency power reserves to the separation process." As the final surge of energy coursed through the station, the organic shell suddenly went dark. All systems fell silent, and for a heart-stopping moment, Voss feared they had failed catastrophically. Then slowly, 3 distinct shapes began to coalesce from the fading vortex of energy. Voss, Dr. Vex, and the entire crew watched in awe, waiting to see if they had succeeded in bringing Nolan and Stella back, and what had become of the hybrid entity that had once been their unified consciousness. Consciousness. For several agonizing seconds, the station remained dark and silent. Captain Voss held his breath, his eyes straining to detect any sign of movement in the inky blackness. The assembled crew stood frozen, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them like a physical force. Suddenly, a faint glimmer caught Voss's eye. The organic shell of the station began to flicker, pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent glow. It started as a mere whisper of light, then grew steadily brighter, casting an ethereal blue-green radiance throughout the central hub. Systems throughout the station hummed back to life, holographic displays blinking into existence as power flowed once more. Dr. Vex's team rushed to their consoles, fingers flying over interfaces as they monitored the reactivation process. "Energy signatures stabilizing," one of the scientists called out, her voice tight with excitement. "I'm detecting 3 distinct patterns. They're coalescing." In the center of the hub, the swirling biomechanical matter began to take shape. Voss watched in awe as 3 distinct figures emerged from the maelstrom. The first 2 were immediately recognizable. Nolan and Stella, their forms a perfect blend of human and Nasat characteristics. Beside them stood a third figure, humanoid in shape but clearly unique, the physical manifestation of the hybrid entity's consciousness. Voss and Dr. Vex rushed forward as the 3 figures stumbled, their newly formed bodies unsteady. They guided them to nearby medical beds, where Dr. Vex's team immediately began running scans. "Incredible," Dr. Vex murmured, her eyes wide as she studied the readouts. Nolan and Stella appear to have retained their individual memories and personalities, but there's more. They've developed enhanced abilities from their time as part of the hybrid entity. As if to demonstrate, Nolan raised a hand, and a nearby console flickered to life. Stella focused her gaze on a section of the wall, and the biomechanical matter rippled and reshaped itself at her unspoken command. The third figure sat up, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intelligence. When it spoke, its voice resonated with a harmonic quality that seemed to fill the entire station. "We are unity," it said, gesturing to encompass itself and the transformed couple. "The separation was successful, but we remain connected on a fundamental level. We can merge and separate at will, sharing our knowledge and abilities." Before Voss could respond, Lou's voice cut through the air. "Captain, incoming transmission from Admiral Hawthorne." Voss nodded, and the Admiral's stern face appeared on the main view screen. His eyes widened as he took in the transformed individuals and the pulsing organic environment of the station. "Captain Voss," Hawthorne said, his voice carefully controlled, "I've witnessed these extraordinary events through our video feed. I'm ordering my fleet to stand down for now. Request permission to board your station and meet these individuals in person." Voss exchanged a glance with Dr. Vex, who nodded encouragingly. "Permission granted, Admiral," he replied. "We welcome the opportunity for peaceful dialogue." As preparations were made for the Admiral's arrival, Nolan and Stella began to explore their new abilities. With a shared look of concentration, they reached out to the station's biomechanical structure. The walls and floor of the central hub began to shift and flow, reshaping themselves into a grand meeting hall suitable for the upcoming diplomatic encounter. Unity, meanwhile, interfaced directly with the station's core systems. Holographic displays sprang to life around it, showing a dizzying array of data streams and system optimizations. "I have analyzed and improved our life support and energy consumption protocols," Unity announced. "Efficiency has been increased by 237% across all systems." Admiral Hawthorne and his team arrived just as the transformations were completed. The Admiral's eyes darted from the newly formed meeting hall to the glowing forms of Nolan, Stella, and Unity. "Welcome aboard Convergence, Admiral," Voss said, using the name that had come to him in a flash of inspiration. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. "Convergence?" Voss nodded. "It seems fitting, given the circumstances. This station has become a point of convergence for human and Nasat technology, biology, and consciousness." The Admiral's gaze settled on Nolan and Stella, who stood hand in hand, their skins shimmering with faint circuitry patterns. "And you two, you're still yourselves?" Nolan stepped forward, his voice steady. "We are, Admiral. We remember everything, our lives before, our time as part of the hybrid entity, and now this new existence. We've gained incredible abilities, but at our core, we're still Nolan and Stella." Stella nodded in agreement. "We can interface directly with the station systems, manipulate its structure, and access vast amounts of data, but our feelings, our memories, they remain our own." Unity approached, its form seeming to shimmer and shift subtly as it moved. "And I am the culmination of their union, a new form of consciousness born from the merging of human, Nasat, and artificial intelligence. Together, we represent a new frontier in the exploration of life itself." Admiral Hawthorne listened intently, his expression a mix of awe and cautious optimism. As Unity finished speaking, the Admiral turned to Captain Voss and Dr. Vex. "I came here prepared for a potential threat," Hawthorne admitted. "Instead, I've found something revolutionary. The potential benefits of this technology, this new form of existence, are staggering." Dr. Vex stepped forward, her eyes shining with excitement. "Admiral, what we have here is an unprecedented opportunity for scientific advancement and interspecies cooperation. If we approach this with open minds and careful study, the possibilities are endless." Hawthorne nodded slowly, his decision visibly forming. "I propose we establish this station, Convergence, as a joint human Nasat research center. We'll need to draft a treaty, of course, to ensure the protection and autonomy of the station while allowing for carefully regulated scientific study." Voss felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's an excellent proposal, Admiral. I believe we can work together to make this a reality." As discussions began in earnest, Nolan and Stella moved to a quiet corner of the newly formed meeting hall. They stood close, their bodies glowing softly in the dimmed light. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up?" Nolan asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. Stella laughed softly, the sound tinged with a new, harmonic quality. "When I first met you, fumbling through that breeding season, not in a million years." They looked out at the gathered humans and Nasats, all working together to shape the future of interspecies, relations, and scientific discovery. Unity moved among them, its presence a constant reminder of the extraordinary transformation they had undergone. As Nolan and Stella watched, The organic shell of the station pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, a visual representation of the new life that had been born from their unexpected connection. They knew that their journey was just getting started, but whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as individuals, as a couple, and as part of something greater than themselves.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.